When we look out into the world, there appears to be an inverse relationship between the capacity for violence or the use of force and one's likelihood to participate in it. And in order to have this conversation better, I wanted to invite a guest on, someone who has been on before, and that's you, Jack. Now, Jack Donovan has, just for trying to get a short introduction in, you've written a series of books, some of them which have been an influence on myself, particularly on masculinity. And then I think I'd describe it as, if I read through your books in order: Way of Man, Becoming a Barbarian, A More Complete Beast, and then Fire in the Dark. It kind of comes across a little bit like a journey from thoughts on masculinity to even getting into mythology and its larger atmosphere. So, Jack, you know you better than I do, so would you give yourself a little introduction? A man with one of the most hated, what do you call it? Wikipedia pages. Badge of honor. I think at this point in time, that's a badge of honor anyway.
Yeah. I mean, I think more and more people know that stuff is written by far left activists. So it is what it is. But no, I mean, obviously, I wrote The Way of Men, which was very, very influential, and has been. I was trolling gender studies, so it's actually been in the top 25 or 30 on the men's gender studies in Amazon for like 10 years. Which is kind of, at the time I categorized it that way specifically because gender studies is ridiculous. And so wrote The Way of Men, also probably for your audience, an essay that's pretty influential for a lot of people. It almost feels dated now, but is Violence is Golden. Because no one cares about saving the whales anymore. You never hear like references like that. That used to be something that people used to talk about. But Violence is Golden is obviously a really important essay. And then recently, I actually wrote a fable based on the same idea called How the Tiger Opened His Third Eye. And I was kind of poking fun at, whatever kind of Western liberals and, yoga people and their peacefulness and mindfulness and everything. And so I basically I wanted to rewrite Violence is Golden in a way that, just from a different angle. And so it's about a tiger who tries to become nonviolent. And then he's studying monks and trying to be peaceful and meditate and be nonviolent, but then he gets really hungry because he's a tiger and he can't really eat plants. And then he attacks one of the monks, and then they shoot at him, and he's like, wait, they're using violence on me. What is this all about? And then so it's kind of an interesting way to tell a story in a different way. And then he meets the great tiger, and the great tiger tells him explains violence and the reality of the world. That's actually available on YouTube. There's a reading of me reading it. It almost reads like a children's story, kind of Jungle Book Kipling-esque kind of thing. And then you can also read it on my website and other places. But
alrighty, so quick question then. In preparation and writing that short story, did you see a pretty stark distinction between Eastern philosophy and mysticism when it comes to where we get the word Zen and so on and so forth, and then like West Coast American Buddhism?
Well, yeah, I actually have a guy in my group, the Order of Fire, who's he spent years in India studying Hinduism. And so I actually had it set because I'm like, well, Bengal tiger, it should be in India. This is where the temple should be. And you can use all the artificial intelligence right now to get all your stories straight really quickly. I'm like, well, what kind of monks would believe this? Find the right, and it was Jainist monks, I think, were the closest to being the ones that would probably die of starvation before being violent, from what we heard. But really no Eastern sect would exactly say it in the way that, say, West Coast hippie, New Age, like white women would say it. It's not the same. It's not the same thing. They're just taking the ideas that they want to hear, and I kind of poked fun at that in the story because I had them talk about the third eye, And all the monks just nodded, but the Western people were like, oh, like the Western visitors who were there were like, ooh, got excited. So I kind of poked fun at that a little bit in there because they're obviously very different things.
Yeah. So there's a similar. I wonder if there's a similar correlation that goes on in our. Well, I think we can actually talk about it now. What is it? It's Saturday, the 27th, date of recording. And if you went on social media in the last 2 days, you might have, or at least yesterday, you would have seen a number of wonderful activists or whatever they were at the French opening for the Olympics that very distinctly themed their entire opening skit on Christianity, including I guess a trans Last Supper. And it's, I mean, I guess and I would put it this way, the photograph itself is a mockery, but
Right.
they're one of the slings and arrows that's oftentimes thrown at faith, especially Christianity, is this idea that it's purely passive.
Right.
And I'd be interested in seeing where that similarity, the similarity between westernized versions of Buddhism, particularly New Age, being wrapped up in emotion, and how these like weird Eastern Enlightenment mentalities being very contrasted by the root of that faith or belief system being in a foreign country, and then Christianity in America, as we see, is very evangelical. And if you were to look at the surface of a lot of evangelicalism, of course, I'm coming from a position of Christianity here, but quite a bit of evangelicalism that you see is in almost the same thing, just an aesthetic trapping of some sort of version of commercialism and feel-good sing-song attitudes. And it has no conviction on the individual, and it has no commitment to truth. And so I think if you were to take, well, quite frankly, if you're going to take the New Testament seriously, the mocking of the Last Supper and of faith, especially if we were to take the New Testament as true, is going to have some pretty dire consequences for some people.
Now, I'm very excited to announce the first official sponsor of the Redacted Culture Cast. Obsidian Arms is one of those companies that reflects the many facets of gun culture. Not only are their firearms frequently found on competition fields like USPSA and 3Gun, but they are a Minnesota-based, US-sourced original equipment manufacturer. Obsidian Arms makes their own punch and tool kits for the amateur and professional gunsmith out of Little Canada, Minnesota, that come with a lifetime warranty. Whether it is fine parts that require a Swiss machine, or you're in the design phase and are looking for an American machine shop that is in tune with the needs of gun culture, go check out Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com. Thank you, and now back to the show.
So, Jack, I've been working on this project, and I've been working on this writing for a while, and because I'm familiar with your writing itself, into some ways I will admit that it has been a bit of an inspiration. I wanted to ask you about what's your take on this concept of the inverse relationship between the capacity for violence and the likelihood to either make threats or participate in it casually. And what I mean by that is, whether anecdotally or through statistics, I tend to find I've observed this consistency amongst particularly men, but it is a little bit broader than just males, that those with the higher skill, or those who are the more skilled an individual is, the more trained they are, the more consistent they are in their disciplining of their body, whether it's through physical fitness, such as going to the gym, running, fine, so whatever, or it's also included in training, whether it's using a firearm or when using a skill like jujitsu. Those people, the more skilled they are, the less likely they are to participate in what we might refer to as casual violence. Some of these anecdotes seem to be very surface level and obvious. And maybe calling it obvious is putting the cart before the horse. But that would be the metaphorical bar fight very rarely involves, or very rarely becomes dangerous amongst boasting characters. but it's the people, if you're concerned about lethal conflict, it's the ones who don't telegraph their actions. They're not very boastful, or they simply just do the violence that are of the greater concern, and are usually of more skill. Two more examples of this is the school shooter, and then let's just use Navy SEALs. The kind of people who go up and shoot up a school very rarely seem to be very skilled at all about what they do, despite what politicians and pundits say. I think this is something we're very thankful for, but at the same time, you look at people who have carried out violence on behalf of the state, Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Delta Force, whatever. Those kind of folks do not make announcements of where they're going to go. Perhaps neither does the school shooter in the same way, even though we oftentimes find evidence of it online after the fact-ish. And this principle, this concept that I've been kind of pondering on the inverse relationship between the capacity of violence or the capacity of the use of force and one's likelihood to participate in it casually or boast about it or make threats, particularly through that of like Twitter, X, online. You see this very consistently. The people who are making death threats, I think, at least I do, observing, very rarely have the physical attributes of somebody that would be concerning in a fight. So since you've written both on masculinity as well as in some of the sense mythology, through history, the concept of boasting has meant different things at different times or had different culturally relevant ideas. And particularly one of those would be the Iliad. And in the Iliad, there's these series of boasts before fights, oftentimes in this kind of challenge of masculinity between characters or challenge of magnanimity. And yet in our day and age, we don't really make threats anymore, especially even if those weren't considered threats, but more like a contest of wits. So what's your take on the concept first, this inverse relationship? And then from there, from your writing and then other things that you've been engaging in and observing, and you're not exactly a passive participant in society, you tend to be rather active. What's your take on it, and what do you see about trends in masculine people versus, I'll use violent people to refer to undisciplinedly violent people?
Well, the easiest reference that popped in my mind as soon as you started talking about this was, I'm sure a lot of your viewers have seen it. There's this great clip of the opening to the movie The Way of the Gun, in which Sarah Silverman runs her mouth and runs her mouth and runs her mouth, and then, surprise, she actually gets hit in the face. But she's trying to start a fight for other people, which is, like the typical thing of someone trying to write a check that someone else is going to have to cash. They're trying to like start, hey, you two fight. And that's what it is the reason why she's surprised that she got hit in the fight is because she expects to be protected. And a lot of these people who are boasting online and saying like, he should be killed, or saying a whole bunch of, running their mouths about a whole bunch of violence, which we see a lot from people who like are protected in the way, whether they're women or whether they're, they've been on the far left or lived in like cities or whatever for their entire lives and have no real experience with violence or sense that it is going to be visited upon them. So they feel free to just say whatever. Versus the idea of, as the old saying that our armed society is a polite society or whatever, because things could escalate. Mm-hmm. And in a way, as a man, you see this tendency on the far left or whatever, of especially girls, and it's very vulgar, to be constantly saying fuck this and fuck that and fuck that, and fuck Trump and fuck this and fuck that, and like. That's a whole category of fighting words like if I say fuck you, like to your face, we're now we're having a moment that could escalate to somewhere. Men are aware of that. Men are aware of that. I don't just walk up to a guy who's bigger than me and say "fuck you," and start using a certain kind of language because because I might have to do the man dance, as they say in the opening show of that clip. I might have to actually do that and follow through on that. Whereas these people who never expect to follow through on it, or to be called to follow through on it, they're free to just talk. And it's really a childlike position. In the way that a little kid can say all kinds of things and no one's going to hit the little kid, and so you can just run your mouth. And people who've always been protected like that are used to talking big talk because they don't actually have to back it up. And a lot of men are in that situation too. A lot of young men, or even like men my age, I'm like Generation X. But a lot of men have been in an environment where they've never been in a violent situation. And really, I hadn't either. I mean, I made it through most of my adult life, aside from like fighting in like junior high school and stuff like that. I mean, you can make it through most of life without being in that kind of situation, unless you're putting yourself in danger almost on purpose, in the way that if a grown man is getting into bar fights, you're like, what is wrong with you? Why are you going out why are you putting yourself in a position where you're going to be, it's like, where the places where the bar fights are going to happen. You're going there looking for them, obviously, because like I can go have a drink in a million places and never even have anything like a bar fight happen, right? So you really have to look for that opportunity for violence if you want it. And the people who have sought that out in whatever way, whether it's through the military or obviously you talked about martial artists, people who have actually been in like MMA fights and so forth, or people who were dumb enough to seek it out when they were kids, and have or like young adults getting into bar fights and all that kind of stuff. They're aware of how that can go and how many variables there are. Like there are a lot of variables floating around. Like you can be pretty well trained and someone can catch you right here, like, and then that story's over. So there's a lot of, I think, an awareness of where violence can go and how many variables there are, and a lot of factors would definitely make men who are more familiar with it a little bit more. Hey, well, this is a real thing. There are real consequences for all these actions, and there are multiple ways that this could go. And so I think men who have that kind of experience and sense of how things could go are, obviously more careful about the way they choose their words. And that's why the funny thing is, when I see people talk like this online, as you said, they kind of conform to a certain type. Physically, they don't look like that they could carry it out. Men, they're talking in the way that they imagine that tough guys talk.
That's a really key point. It's like a caricature of the tough guy, but everyone else sees it as a caricature, but the person speaking seems to be ignorant of their own, maybe.
Right. Well, and all their friends affirm that. All their friends are like, well, yeah, because they're all the same. They're in the same social group. But like from the outside, it seems ridiculous, and men don't actually talk like that. Like I'm not going to have that conversation in that way with someone who we could get into it.
There's two connecting points two points that stand out. One of them is that in the Old Testament, well, not even in the Old Testament, in the Bible, there's this phrase that says, "Let your yes be yes and your no be no." Like there's sort of a seriousness to it. Like if you're going to say things, back it up. You don't need to make boasts and promises and swearing on God to simply say something. And so that part stands out. The other one, though, is you brought it up earlier. You brought it up in that conversation. A person doesn't need to be skilled to be dangerous. Again, taking somebody who is in years an adult, but in moral development and maybe skill development is a foolish child of a sense. And I'm not talking about like mental development. I'm talking about the kind of person that you see who has graduated from college, whose body is shaped like a stretched out Smurf, who would have probably been better off if he had never participated in the academic system at all, because it has clearly ruined him, who might proudly call himself a communist and whatever. There's a certain, I'm being a little over the top on this one, but that is, I mean, you give them a Tommy gun and they're still going to be dangerous. They're still going to be absolutely dangerous. They're just, their violence is not going to be pointed. It's just going to be general.
Right. And also, I mean, I've joked about this a few times in jiu-jitsu recently. Like, there's even a dude off the street who it's his first day can be a hassle. Like, can be a little bit of a hassle, even, okay, well, I know he's going to do this and whatever, but he's going to surprise you because he doesn't know what he's doing. He's not going to conform to the rules of the game. And so he's just going to push in all kinds of different ways and do all kinds of erratic things. And therefore, he can kind of, those guys are actually kind of dangerous for guys who do jiu-jitsu, because it's like, well, okay, I have to contain this because he's a mess. But because they're doing a certain form, and he's just everywhere. And I'm like, that's kind of how people get hurt, when they don't know what they're doing. And the same thing in the sense of, you see all those kind of McDojo videos of women's self-defense classes where they just, like, hit a man and he pushes a man and he falls down and whatever. And man, I've been working on takedowns for the past year because it's a part of my game I really want to work at. And it is really hard to take a man down if he's ready. If he's like, and not even if he's good, it's like if he just doesn't want to go down, a grown, like a 200-pound man, if you're trying to take him down and he just doesn't want to, like, that's tough. It's a tough, even if you know what you're doing and have like an idea of like 7 different techniques that I could use to do it, they're going to be a hassle. And so it's like, as you said, even an unskilled person can create, there's potential for mayhem, I guess, there.
Yeah, I brought up the reference of firearms particularly because of how culturally there is this attitude that you find both inside and outside of what I would call gun culture that approaches the firearm kind of like a magic wand. There's a sort of mystical, and I don't think you can accuse the Westerns of it, but there's every once in a while when I'm reading literature about Westerns, which is a little layer upon layer, you get this kind of idea that the cowboy or the gunslinger is like the knight of American West, and the gun is his sword. And ultimately, we find out very quickly that that is not the case in the real world. That a handgun is not a magic wand. It's even though we actually do make jokes about, oh, it's my 100% off coupon. It's like, yeah, but this is just not how it works. We can laugh at it. Maybe it's an inside joke, but you see amongst these kind of people, and I've observed it firsthand in the street, that the kind of person who has an overinflated sense of their power, I use power loosely, because they're in possession of a firearm, finds out very quickly that it's not a magic wand, that somebody with a modicum of training, a degree or two above theirs, is going to be infinitely more capable of using that tool for its designed purpose, which is the taking and preservation of life. And so I want to dig a little deeper into cases of where this principle can be observed and where we might be able to contradict it.
Okay.
And particularly one subject that you've come to mind on frequently is the relationship between strength and honor in this sense. We might argue, I think you might argue, that strength has to do with this capacity. There's something about strength that there's something about strength that has to do with this capacity. And that is something that I have enjoyed about and I think and this is intended to be a compliment. One of the things about the Way of Men that was done well is that strength was not just muscle. Now, we intuitively know some of this, but honor was a category you listed as a masculine virtue that I would have originally attributed to morality, which is on the other side of being a good man versus being good at being a man.
Right.
How do you see honor in the way that you have written about it, and maybe if your a position on it has changed in some sense? How is honor related to capacity or capability of violence and strength?
Interesting.
We might need to. I mean,
Basically-
I did just throw this on you, so if we need to kind of work into it, that's
No. It's. I mean, the way I wrote about honor was, the Way of Men. When we talk about the tactical virtues, it's more about what men are looking for each other, like what men are looking for in each other, and that reciprocity, that mutual respect, is really what honor is. Like, I care about what you think about me, and you care about what I think about you. And that's it, because if you can't really function as a working group without some of that. Like, if you don't respect each other basically and care about each other's opinions, you can't work as a tactical operation, because like, okay, well, I'll just do whatever I want, is not really functional on a team. And so you have to have some kind of respect for that. And over, obviously, if you're, especially in a tribal situation, more than like following orders or whatever, there's a long-term relationship there too. So your sense of your reputation among your peers has a long-term thing. So it's not like, in any group of men that you've ever been in, like, they'll remember something you did 5 years ago, especially if it was stupid. So they'll, there's all these things, carry with you. So men are very concerned about that in the past. Where the extent that is related to capacity, I don't know. The thing is, being afraid that of the way that other men will perceive you can make you dangerous in a certain way. In the way that men in your group, there are things that you would do when other men are watching that you wouldn't do if they weren't. I think
Sure.
is basically at that point I'm trying to get at. Men will make moves that they wouldn't make if they were by themselves. If the group, there's that kind of collective violence that can happen. That collective, like the madness of the crowd.
okay.
To a
Yep.
certain- Yeah.
So that's one element of it, and then the other one would be, you would not, if a man values honor, he would not use violence dishonorably amongst his peers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
okay.
Like in whatever way that they would consider dishonorably, because that's going to change from group to group to a certain extent. But that is, he's going to be mindful of whatever their rules are about that. So.
Okay. Then, So then, there are certain rules that we can find consistent, I think, in things that you do in secret are not the same things that you do in front of other people. I am by no means any sort of origin author on this concept.
Right.
And the anonymity of the internet, or the supposed anonymity of the internet, can be useful in explaining away a lot of these Twitter-like threats. But what about with people who are deliberately perceived as weak, so as to get away with making threats? And I'll use an example that's politically relevant, and then I'll move. And then I guess there's two examples that are politically relevant. Joe Biden, as the president, has made allusions or even open threats, in some sense, against the American people regarding the use of force, jets and F-15s, and if you want to fight against the government, you have to have an F-15. Like, well, I don't. That statement, those statements are made in a context that either we are not privy to, or a context that is not real. And given the mental condition of the character, I would assume it's the latter. But if Joe Biden and another candidate who is perceived as, well, not candidate, another political individual who is perceived as being strong, and I mean strong in that they are capable of wielding force, whether it's political force or power or whatever, were to make a threat of that magnitude, it would be taken very differently. Another example of it would be Minneapolis 2021, Summer of Love 2.0. It's going on, or 2020 into 2021. You'd hear people making threats. Even one like the name, there's again another politician, flew into town, Maxine Waters, and was standing on with a bullhorn, saying things that if she were, let's just say, tattooed and bearded like, again, a Army Ranger, Navy SEAL, Delta Force guy, they'd be right in prison immediately. Like, but she was culturally allowed to say these things, calls for violence openly and publicly to a group of people who had already demonstrated that they're willing to light buildings on fire, because she was perceived as not being capable of carrying it out. I think that's the best I can get for it, because other than it just being some sort of political doublespeak, I've noticed this consistency where, like, you know, if a 4-year-old comes up to me and says she's going to stab me, I'm not going to treat her like someone who I'm worried about stabbing me.
Right.
But at the same time, when people reach adulthood, there's this sort of difficulty there. Because I can look at plenty of people who've made death threats and say, who in all intents and purposes had the capability of carrying it out, maybe not in a skilled way, but it didn't mean that we just turned them off. It was isolate and disarm or something. But I'm asking this question in a broader text, particularly because I am trying to get out of the anecdotal phase and start getting into how have we seen it historically? How have you seen it in myth? And maybe in a sense, why is it so dishonorable? Why is it so why is the flavor of it so bitter?
Well, you know, there's that thing in the political world of it kind of being a joke, like, well, if we did that, it would be taken totally differently. And there's a certain flavor of what's going on with someone like a Maxine Waters, or, you know, like AOC could go out and do the exact same thing and say, like, they should burn these buildings down and kill everyone in them. And they'd be like, I can't believe she said that. If we said that, and the reason is because I think she's speaking for a group of people who are going to protect her. If she was in the minority in what was she was trying to incite or have things done, it would be a different thing. So I think that she's protected by the state apparatus, you know.
Yes.
Whereas if you know, tattooed ex-army guy comes out and says, we're gonna take charge of some things and hurt some people, that's a threat to the state. And
Okay.
so, like, I think that's a big, you know, that's the distance here. If he came out and said, I'm with Black Lives Matter and we're gonna burn this city out, and he came as an emissary of the state, I think he would probably be given a pass. So it's, you know, it just depends who it is and what the political context of something like that is. But yeah, obviously, I mean, I think it comes down to the same thing we were talking about before, in the way that I also say, like the voices of computer things and teleprompter, like, well, not teleprompters, but you know, when you call a bank or whatever, it's always a female voice, because that's supposed to be soothing, and you're not going to take it as a conflict. Whereas, you know, like, it's just a non-conflict associated voice if you use a female voice in something, and whereas if you have a man do something, and this is why we have so many popular female politicians, I believe, on the right, is because if a man says something, it looks threatening. It can say the exact same thing, but like if a female something like says the same thing, she's a strong mama bear. It becomes this motherly, like endearing thing. Whereas if she said we should lock up all child predators, and if a guy says it, it's like, oh well, he's unhinged. But if she says it, she's a strong mama bear protecting children. It's the same, and they're both saying the same thing, and they're both right. But it's a non-threatening position that it's coming from. And so there's so many women in politics, I think, who can go out and say things that men won't say because men aren't threatened by them. They don't say, hey, there's another guy creating a threatening situation for me. And also women are not threatened by them either. They don't feel like there's a man imposing on them. So it's very easy.
How have you seen in classic myth and philosophy where this frustration arises, particularly that of a rise in cosmopolitan, weak people claiming to say things that they really have no significance in carrying through? It's not this. I know it's not a distinctly contemporary problem, although the contemporary might be more of it's easy for us to see. It's easy for me to make an excuse and make an observation, say, well, threats on the internet are just threats on the internet. Like I don't take them as seriously as I do in the real world. I live in Arizona right now. I mean, we both do, but we're in the part of the state that we're living in. We're seeing a kind of a migration of homeless people. Now, their proximity to my home is something that I keep attention. I pay attention to, and in some ways, exactly like that. And admittedly, in that way of the individual who is concerned about it but doesn't want it on his lawn. But at the same time, my point in this address is I can look at our contemporary culture, and I don't think it's fruitful to say everything in society is against masculinity and it's creating this kind of weird corrupted feminism alone, unless I can give some anecdotal or not more than just anecdotal evidence. However, and this is the one being, feminine men are more dangerous, not in a good way, not in an effective way, than masculine men, particularly because masculine men are not necessarily predictable. That would be an improper way of saying it. But feminine men are much more likely to engage in meaningless, needless violence out of a sense of resentment or apathy, not apathy, resentment or just malice or just anger. And so in our world, in the one that we have, we can very easily say, oh, you wouldn't say that if you had to say it to my face. Absolutely true. There are things that you would not say if you didn't have to say to my face. But what does that do to a person when more and more of our lives and more of our business and our participation in the world is filtered through screens of HR, where not only can I not threaten you because it will get taken down by an AI, but if I do manage to find a way to threaten you, it will not be taken seriously. And so how can I even take my own thoughts seriously if it has no meaningful significance to my life? And so I started this monologue or this question earlier with, where have you seen this in philosophy, in history, in historical writing? And have you found any references to it in mythology, or at least in the culture and the community that you have spent your time in?
I mean, I feel like that's one of the things I'd have to go back and research.
Sure.
I'd have to go look for it. Because
that's fair.
The one thing that I could, you brought up boasting culture, which is very interesting. It's an interesting subject, and how that was very much part of masculine culture, and it's kind of the opposite of what we're talking about. In case we're kind of talking about not boasting and being, like, I'm aware of violence and so I'm quiet about it, But boasting culture is the exact opposite of that. And it was, as you're saying, you see it in the Iliad and so forth. But
And you see it in the Old Testament. There's very clear cases where a king or a person who's in charge of a city is standing on the gates of a city, looking down at the opposing army, saying, "You will break upon our walls." And this is coming from characters who are presented as both moral on the side of God and immoral. So it's a universal.
yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, there's you want to scare the people you're about to attack or who are about to attack you. So there's part of that, and I guess that's the strategy of it. Like the person who seems most confident in their ability to execute violence is doing psychological warfare on the person who is maybe less able, or maybe is equally able, but it's who dares wins to a certain extent. Like the guy who talks a big game might get in your head, in the way that they do between, like, whether it's UFC fights or boxing matches or whatever. The guy who talks a big game is it might get in the other guy's head. And that's part of the strategy of actually doing that. So that's actually, I think, part of the culture that we see that's a through line in all this is boasting. Boasting is psychological warfare to a certain extent, or it's meant to be. It's meant to, like, get in the other guy's head and screw him up. And the best article, the finest article on all the internet, that I always introduce it as that for many, many years. This is, and it's still online. It's like a decade or 15 years now. It's called The Journal of Manly Arts, I'm pretty sure. And there is an article on eye gouging, like Southern eye gouging. And it was basically like this long kind of academic article going through all the source material from, like, I don't know, like maybe 19th century back, talking about, like, the Scots-Irish and like their tradition of eye gouging, which was a problem, I guess, in the South. So they were like, these dudes would sharpen their nails so that they could rip another dude's eye out. And it's wild. And you have people coming in from England and seeing this and whatever and be like, these are no better than animals. There's all these quotes of, like, them being just horrified about what these people are doing. But part of the big part of their display is, like, walking around talking like, I've been, I've killed 1,000 men, taken 100 eyes. I will go. Like, this big boasting performance is part of the whole show that happens before these guys rip each other's eye out. It's wild. So yeah, you could probably put a link to it in the notes or whatever. I think anyone would be entertained by this article just because of the depth of, like, I cannot believe this was real, of these guys went around pulling each other's eyes out. And they're like, I pulled it out by its eye strings. Like, you can see the, like it's savage.
Yeah.
But it's just, but that's the first, when I think of boasting culture, that's kind of the first thing that comes to mind. These guys peacocking around about to, like, take each other's eyes out. And that's definitely related to honor culture as well, because, there's this whole honor in their community that trying to become known for the guy that you don't mess with. And so they're doing that. Yeah.
Do you make a distinction between honor culture, which reminds me of, like, Why Honor Matters by Somers? Do you make a distinction between that and the way that you wrote about honor in The Way of Men?
There's all kinds of elements to honor, because it's a tricky subject, because it's this word that we love.
Yes.
Men love the word honor. It's this beautiful thing, right? And it's this beautiful thing, and that's why I wrote about it, is because it has to do with your esteem within the group. Really,
yes.
Like, it means that you matter and that you're important, and it's your reputation and it's something you care about. And there was I don't know that I've read the book that you mentioned, but the one that I read when I was doing research back in the day was James Bowman's book on honor, and he was a conservative writing about it. And he talked about reflexive honor, being basically like, if you do something to me, I have to do something back to you, or then it becomes clear that anyone can do anything to me. So there's this thing that you have to reciprocate violence or acts of violence in some way, otherwise you become vulnerable. And I mean, you see that, I mean, that's true of politics and war and all kinds of things, but at the individual level as well. I think there's a quote, and I've never been able to find it again, but like, if a man can steal my chickens, he might as well he can rape my daughters. It's something like if you let him do this, it's eventually gonna go there. And so, yeah, there's this level of honor culture that has to do with that. And then mostly because of, Christianity and other things, cultural developments over time, honor culture had to do with your personal relationship with honor. Like your personal honor, like what I believe is right is different necessarily from what the group wants me to do. And like those are two different things. So when we talk about honor, we have those two different kinds of honor competing with each other, because in our modern world, like, I mean, personally, like when I think of my honor, I don't really have a peer group that makes me do violence or makes me do certain things. I mean, obviously I have men that I associate with here and there, and I care about what they're like readers of mine who I really respect.
Yes.
I actually was going to post something really crass the other day, and I was just like, I can think of 10 former cops or like whatever who I really respect, who would be like, Jack, like, come on, man. I mean, there are lots of people who would be mad about whatever, but there's guys who I'm like, really don't want to. He would frown upon that. I'm just going to not do that. So that's kind of a collective honor thing, even though they don't even know that I'm making that decision with them in mind. But then there's also the like, what do I think is right and wrong personally on a very individual level? And we think of that as being your honor or your personal honor as well. So there's just these two competing versions, like personal and public honor are very different things.
Yes, I can see that in the world of the private military contractor is a very interesting world if you were to be able to peel it back. There are elements of it that are extremely simple and straightforward. Do your job, be on time. Don't be dressed and don't be carrying the certain equipment, be dressed appropriately, so on and so forth. And then there are elements of it that are much more complicated. And one of those has to do with reputation. And since it's such a small world, your reputation will always precede you. And to the extent that if you don't have one, it might be considered suspect. Now, most individuals that I've encountered who are active in this field are at least, I'll say, at least tacitly aware of the reputations of the people who are around them. The ones who pay too much attention to it tend to stand out, and the ones who are completely ignorant of it typically don't stay around, or they change, they have to adapt. And so, once again, it's a profession of sorts that has a potentiality of violence where reputation matters quite greatly. Honor amongst them, and I can speak, maybe I'm imposing myself in some sense as a representation, is a very unspoken category. Stand up straight, be on time, speak with respect to other people, don't be conniving. If you sign on to a gig and you start working with your team and you're in a two-man group, despite everyone else being split up, and the first thing that your partner does is start complaining about management, it's a little bit dishonorable. It's not the worst thing. Or if you're making excuses for what you do, you're not owning up to your failures. That's another one. But it's quite different than individual morality. And I can see the argument being made on, historically speaking, we've trended towards the individual. Honor has become a very personal thing. Mm-hmm. sometimes I wonder if it can, because it seems to be. Is that would you argue that it's more of a misuse of the word? Because like, how can you be honoring to nothing, or to yourself, or to just a loose collection of values? Like, honoring involves two parties. Am I right?
Not necessarily. Let me Wiktionary that.
Okay.
Because I mean, that's one of those things. That's the first thing I'm going to do whenever I have a discussion about words.
Okay.
Because we can talk about our feelings about words, but like what's the etymology of that? Like, where does it come from? Where do we
Fair.
get it? So like, I think that's always the first place to go when you're talking about this stuff. And the Wiktionary. Oh, I put it in airplane mode. I'm like, for the show. Yeah, let me do that.
I can pull it. I can pull a tab up too.
Okay.
Adam.
I mean, it's just it's always etymology always gives you information, even though sometimes it's disappointing.
Sure.
Like the word noble is disappointing. Like it could, because you want it to mean something fantastic, and it really just means well known or famous. Like that, like the roots of it really means like, oh, this is like Paris Hilton. Like it means
Yeah, right.
It means famous, like, or the aristocrats. It doesn't mean like, you want it to mean like righteous and like good and all these other things. But we put that on it, and that's valid that we put that on it, and it has a complicated meaning over time, but the root of it is disappointing.
The root of noble is just it's not a ontological distinction between people's characteristics. It's simply, oh yeah, people know who he is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nobilis. Yeah.
Old French word honor.
Yep.
Verb, Latin from. So it's Middle English to Old French to Latin.
It's to Latin. Okay, so Latin is annos.
If this source is correct, then we're going glory, renown, fame earned from Anglo-French honor or Old French owner. Blah blah blah.
Yeah, and then it goes to the Latin, which is annos, and then it talks about Cicero and the Proto-Indo-European root of it. But it looks like, when you get into the Latin, which is what I think the oldest source it looks like is, you're getting into dignity, reputation, esteem.
Yeah.
So basically, what we're talking about is the same thing. I mean, esteem is one of those things. Because in the same way, like worship comes from like the Old English, like worshipa or something like that, and it means to give worth to something. It doesn't actually mean exactly what people think it means in the same way. It give worth to something, and honor is kind of like that as well. I mean, it has that, like, we honor a thing. So I don't think that. But the concept of honor, as we're talking about it in a group of men, is very specific. Like I said, it's one of these words that it's beautiful, and because it's associated with like your status in a group of men, but it has, in the modern context, it means good. Like honor society. Like I did good in school. The name is. It's taken on a lot of meanings over time.
A judge, Your Honor.
Yeah.
A person in honor society.
Yep.
Then, graduated with honors. I will honor my word. Mm-hmm. So maybe a little bit more of a verb.
Yeah.
So when you meet the kind of person, there's a bit of a caricature in gun culture that I believe is very much so going out of trend. And I think that it's a hypothesis, but I think the rise of this caricature of an individual can be closely tied to the early days of the internet, and that is the lone wolf. This idea of like, and I'm not talking about a lone gunman or a lone crazy. I'm talking about I don't need a tribe. I don't need a group of people. You know, this is it's a very adolescent mentality of I'm going to do it all. You know, I do it all on my own. I don't need it. I'm a lone wolf. And you're like, okay, you know, we've all met people like this. At least maybe
I'm a
I just
Sigma.
sure. Yeah, I mean that's a good one. That's a
Yeah,
there's some loaded language in there.
for sure.
But the can't get distracted. But needless to say, there's this idea of this being like a loner, like a captain of your own ship, man on the mountain, and the weird persona of it is very different than an independent individual. Like everyone wants to think for themselves, conveniently in the same way, without reading anybody else's work. So they think they're just entirely original, and you realize they're not.
Right.
Or I'm going back to the caricature within gun culture, is this idea of the lone wolf. Like, I don't need a tribe, I don't need a group of people, I can do it all on my own. I wouldn't be in a club that would, I wouldn't be in any club that would have me. It's like, that says a lot about your character, that you actually hate yourself. This is really weird. I'm not sure. Maybe a counselor's good for you.
Right.
Maybe you should go do something difficult. But in the same way, what's the word? Craven? Cowardly?
Yeah.
Someone who won't stand up for anything also resembles a different type, but of a very similar despicable person. And so when we observe in our world, in the world, the people who engage in what are referred to as random acts of violence, personal gripe. I'm actually rather tired of hearing the word unprecedented, or the violence he did was unthinkable. No, sir, he thought about it. He wrote a book about it. He wrote something about it. He very much so thought about the violence he was going to do. This phrase, this kind of caricature of an individual, the lone wolf and whatever, tends to be has a potential of being dangerous, which is why I think we find them distasteful. I'm not saying that they're skilled, but they're dangerous.
Yeah, well, there's a big romanticism about that in American culture. I mean, that's the Clint Eastwood character. I think I wrote about this a lot, actually, in Becoming a Barbarian and The Way of Men to a certain extent. But especially in Becoming a Barbarian, I think the phrase I used was a lone tumbleweed of God's own violence, or something like that. Like somebody rolling from town to town who just is always doing the right thing, but like also is emotionally damaged and can't stay. Like wherever he goes, Mad Max is the same character.
Yep.
He just goes from place to place, and they want him to stay, and he was the hero. No, I must move on. And like this is mostly emotionally damaged character who actually can't have friends or stay anywhere in the long term. And that's so it's been very romanticized by Hollywood, I think, and so it's become a very big part of American culture. I don't know how big of a thing that was before that, but if you think about the frontier, and so many people probably like doing that not really because it was the best idea, but just because I'm going out to find my own way. Eventually they had to hook up with other people because that's how society works. But, there's a lot of idea. You can imagine a lot of people wandering around, and doing things. So it's, you can see how it was picked up to be romanticized. But yeah, I mean, that person obviously, I would love to say that I could maybe even be given some credit, but no one never does, for maybe influencing that to a certain extent, just because talking about the way that men need to be in groups for a long time, and the idea that the lone wolf is a kind of a foolish character, and that's not how things actually get done in society. Like men get things done in groups. Like one guy doesn't change a lot of things. One guy as a leader of a group can change a lot of things, but one guy by himself doesn't do a whole lot, whether you're talking about violence or almost anything else.
Well, to be clear, you're talking about credit, and well, yes, if I am a single anecdote, like I have read Becoming a Barbarian a couple times, and this is somewhere where it has affected my way of thinking.
Right.
It's really hard. And also another one that came before you was, it's really hard to try to be a lone wolf in the military. Like, it's just, it's not a good look, dude. It's not a good look. You probably shouldn't go that way. So, there are maybe, is there, do you encounter this? You know, we've brought up a number of your publication, the books that you've published in the past. Where you're at now, and this is a bit of, not necessarily a pivot, but a slight alteration of our course.
Sure.
Do you find yourself, as you're where you're at now, it's easy for someone like me to reference things that you've written in the past? Where are you at looking going forward? How do you, as a person who's written a number of books that have done quite well, look at what's next? Or what you're working on now, or what do you want to work on, or the direction that you want to go?
Oh yeah, well that's always the big question. Because I've joked recently that being Jack Donovan is my W-2. Just in the sense of like, okay, well we're going to talk about like there's this collection. People call it a trilogy. It wasn't written as a trilogy, but like my first 3 books, or the most popular 3 books, I guess. Starting with The Way of Men, have a little kind of arc, and they have similar covers, and they're the same thing. And then Fire in the Dark was very much a departure from that. And one of the reasons why is really me trying to find, I guess, what my dharma is. I've come to like that recently, just because as a group, the Order of Fire read the Ramayana, and which is actually pretty great. It's like most beloved book of like 1 billion people. But it's a lot of talk of like, for who you are, what is the correct path for you? Like, based on your status in life and your talents and all those things, what is the correct path that the universe has for you? And because you can't go and be that other guy necessarily. And one of those things that I've found since writing The Way of Men is like, I was able to capitalize on that because nobody was talking about that at that time. And then what I think happened is that, the idea of talking to men about masculinity has really blown up to the point where it's boring to me now, because if you look on Instagram or whatever and flip through it, there's 1 million dudes giving dudes advice about how to live your life. And I never really did that. I wanted to talk about the theory and the concepts behind masculinity. I'm not, hey, be like me. It's like, we live in a world with Andrew Tate now. And that was not true when I wrote The Way of Men. Whether it's Andrew Tate or Jocko or all these other people, there are all these other figures out there doing that work. And what I said still stands and is good, but I have to figure out what I am best suited to do.
Yes.
And like, what's my dharma? What's my task that I bring? And you've seen it probably a little bit over the years, man. I shifted a little bit more towards mythology, and a little bit more towards art, I think, is because that's something I have that Jocko doesn't. Although he wrote a fiction book recently, but he's not really the example that I'm trying to compete with in any way. But some of these guys don't have that piece, and that's something I've always had. So in an effort, like, how do I talk this? And also, really, it's, you have to keep it interesting for yourself. As a man and an artist and whatever, you have to write about things and talk about things and work on projects that excite you. And if you don't, sometimes that's you end up screwing yourself over, because you're not as passionate about it, and then people can read that. Really right now, it's like, obviously wrote Fire in the Dark, talking about mythology and masculinity. Then I started this group called the Order of Fire, and that's kind of my main project right now in terms of growing that. It's almost 2 years old right now, and it's not for everybody. It's not meant to be for everybody, but it basically builds out the concepts that I talked about in that book and brings it into life. Like, let's create a new culture from scratch. I mean, literally today, this morning, what I was doing was like, we need songs. Men have songs to sing. We need songs. And I'm on an AI being like, what are the forms of songs that men sung, like the ballad forms or whatever, like, and we're talking about this in one of our groups within the group. So like creating culture from scratch. And that's something that's actually, its time is coming, is that there was a problem, and we've been talking about it, I've talked about it, I've given speech to whatever, is that only the left can create art. And that has been a problem in the 20th century. That's not a problem historically at all. But it's been a problem in the 20th century, is that the left kind of commanded art. And unfortunately, when you command art, you create culture, and you're actually writing the stories and the mythology that everybody is pulling from. So that's very influential in a lot of ways. And so there's a need to create culture now. And I mean, that's within my wheelhouse to a certain extent. And I really need to challenge myself in that way. I mean, I did that project, Invocation of the Storm, which not everybody got, but like I got it, and I still think it's awesome. So if you can do things in life, you're like, I don't care what anybody thinks. I think that's fucking rad. And that was exactly what I was trying to do.
I got to see the release.
Yeah. So there's that, and then I may write a book on virtue.
Like virtue as in virtue ethics, or virtues as in ethics itself?
It kind of is in virtue ethics. There's,
Okay.
it's a very complicated subject in itself, but
Absolutely.
in the sense of why pursue virtue, and what virtues would you pursue if you were starting from scratch, and that's why I think I need to. In order to do that, it came out of a lot of discussions that Chris and I have been having. CB Robertson,
Yep.
He's been on your show, I know,
Yep.
and I mean, we do a weekly live show together, and we talk about the things we're interested in, and the whole discussion of free will and fate and dharma and all these things. Like, is there? Because if you don't have free will, then what point is virtue? Like what point does virtue serve? And then so you really have to deal with the concept, at least, of free will and fate and all that, because that's all linked to virtue.
Yes, we're going to get, in order to have a conversation on virtue, you have to have a conversation on metaphysics and what is real and what is true. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So just I think that's interesting to dig into. It's one of those things. I've never written a book in really much less than 2 years, so like it's something I've avoided doing after the last one, because it's like a birthing process that's horrible. But it's something I'm thinking about doing. But other than that, I think I need to focus on actually making more visual art, and maybe more things like the Invocation of the Storm and stuff like that, because there is a growing desire for that, I think, now, that there wasn't before, on the, I don't like to say even the right, because I think that's whatever, but the non-left, like the non-woke, the non-Marxist, whatever. I think there's a desire for that in those circles. So I think there's only one guy doing it that I really like, which is Fendevier, he's a sculptor, and he's doing sculptures basically that are kind of Art Deco and Vorticist and Futurist inspired, but they feel new, and but they're on. He does it, on strong themes. His favorite piece, I think, is called Tackle. Like, my favorite piece of his is called Tackle, and it's like basically this other guy tackling another guy, but it's so full of movement and whatever. It's amazing, and he's at the point where he's being commissioned to do sculptures, and he just got a commission to do a monument. So and he's outspoken of like, we need a culture of strength and beauty and like saying all the right things, and no one else is really doing that with any skill. So,
There are a number of artists within the gun culture community that might be extended beyond that. Two of them, the two that immediately come to mind, are Ethan Gypsy Walters, and then Bad Moon Print Press. Both of them are artists who draw but um, I mean, I don't know if they probably don't have the same mainstream appeal as somebody like Taylor Swift, which is comparing a musician to an artist, but that's a different thing. So there's 2 points that I have to that I want to bring up, and one of them is that you were talking about your group, and it's not for everybody.
Right.
This isn't a conversation about your group. It is a conversation about the idea of exclusivity. And I'm in my 30s. Grew up during the global war on terror. The heroes were always the special operations guys. So I went into special operations. It's a selective process. Not everybody gets in. At least that's what it's supposed to be. And it's not for everybody. Not everybody has it. Not everyone has it's not the knack. There's a certain trait that the best I can describe it is the capability to look at a morally ambiguous situation that has high consequences, specifically the use of force and violence, who's able to understand that there are high consequences but still make actions. Ranger School. You're graded in many ways, not on the performance alone, but how do you persevere through adversity? Same thing with the selection process. You're given an impossible task that you're not informed is an impossible task. And the observation is, how will he persevere after he comes to the realization that the task cannot be completed? Will he quit or will he strive on? So in this example of a masculine group is not for everybody. And this is also calling back to becoming a barbarian in the empire of nothing and multiculturalism. And I think what I would refer to as the end of the secular age, where belief is just one option amongst many. It's just a fashion statement we change. You're saying that your community is not for everybody. And yet you still pursue it as if it has meaning for yourself or for your group or for your people. This, again, you have something more. There is something of weight to it. There's not just gravitas. I'm not talking about just an aesthetic and a moral compulsion, an aesthetic compulsion, but a moral to it as well. There's something right about pursuing the honor of other men to a certain extent. Not too much or you become vain, not too little or you are considered crass or something else. You're considered, I'd go back to craven. So when you say it's not for everybody, how do you look at communities and groups and cultures and the right and the left? And then we'll go into art is not for everybody. Or not, sorry, art is has been primarily a left-wing process. Let's stick to this idea of exclusivity.
Okay. Well, I mean, I've always framed humans as being tribal animals. I don't think that universal, like the mythology, which sounds great in pop songs, but the ideas of us all like being the whole world will live as one. I don't really think that that's how humans really operate. I don't think we're really designed that way. And
is this an is or an ought argument?
Is.
Okay, so you're saying it's not possible.
Yeah. I believe that every time that is tried, it involves mass murder to even get in close. Like if you want to get everyone on the same page, a lot of people will not want to get on that page, and to get them on the same page, you have to do things like the Cultural Revolution. That's and whether it's religious or secular, they have to do the same thing to get everyone on the same page. It's because I think that men want agency.
Yes.
And they want to have a say. And if the system becomes so big that they don't have a say anymore, they're going to fragment naturally.
Yes.
And so I feel tribalism is a part of human nature, and it's always going to be that way. So I'd rather approach things as if, okay, well, this is what men are going to do anyway. So let's design our perception of reality around what men are actually going to do versus how we wish that they would behave. And so, like, I'd look at human universals and things like that, but when study different societies, and what do men always do? And that's kind of how I got to the way of men.
Yes.
Take away this blank slate idea that we're like infinitely changeable and that we have a nature. And so I believe that men are always going to form different groups. And a lot of meaning in life comes from, choosing or being part of, because most people are born into groups, that group and its distinct identity.
Okay.
And so if you're going to be about something, you can't be about everything. If something, to mean something, it can't mean everything. For a word to mean, for a group to be about something, it can't mean everything. So by its very nature, by having a definition and wanting, and having a vision, it's going to be exclusive. Like not everyone can be a part of it. And so I guess that's what I mean by that, is that, like I have a direction that I'm going, and then also as you get a group of guys together, there, as a culture forms, there you end up having a consensus, and a lot of times it's unspoken consensus as the group evolves. And you were kind of talking about that with special forces and other kind of things. You have an unspoken consensus about this is what's acceptable and this is what's not. And like, if someone comes in and I think their views are way off of what the guys will be okay with, they're not going to get in, because it's like, well, if we can't, which is not a great marketing model, I can tell you. But it's like, you need to, it's like, well, did this guy make sense in the group? Like, does he make sense in some way? And sometimes you roll the dice, but there is a consensus about who we are and what we believe that evolves over time.
So this, I think, is where some of that danger of like the idea of the Sigma male thing comes in. Oddly enough, not to derail it entirely, but is if you do not mold, you do not blend well with the group, and we'll use this as like an activity that has consequences, and going back to kind of special operations or Ranger Battalion or whatever. If you're the pariah in the group, that has more consequences for the group as a whole than just the discomfort of your relationship or the discomfort of the community. Now, what's more important, I want to go back into this idea of tribe. Yes, I think at the time, and your writing has had an influence on it, quantified, not in this conversation, but sure. Where I think tribe has gone wrong, and I've seen tribe go wrong, is that the presence of tribe is elevated to a moral ought. You were saying that you were talking about it as an is, in this side of the guillotine of is. People will function in a tribal fashion, as in they will desire to surround themselves with people who have similar values, similar things that they hold in high regard or esteem, and they will distance themselves from people who view the opposite. Any group that you have, maybe I heard this correctly from you, if you have a group of people centered around a series of values, and somebody tries to enter that group with antithetical values, opposite of it, they're not going to get along. Hence, what we see in film, when somebody who hates the source material gets into the director's position because it's going to do her thing, they ruin the franchise immediately. And so, what do you see as the pitfalls and as someone who's been in your position for some time, about approaching tribe and preventing you from turning it into an idol, particularly that of, and I'll use this one more time as an example of like military and special operations. What do people talk about the military? Oh, camaraderie, a sense of brotherhood and belonging. sometimes, but like that's not sufficient. It's not enough. It's not you can't assume that the military is going to give you that experience. There's something else that has to happen. So with Tribe, whether it's books that have been written or in your own study, what are your, not necessarily, maybe isn't intended to be advice, but how would you approach Tribe differently after you've read, written, and thought and functioned in that environment for some time?
Well, there's how I would do it, and then there's what works.
Fair. Fair.
There's things that work really well, and they work well for a reason, and they're magic words, and one of them is brotherhood.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually refuse to use brotherhood in my group. I don't like ban it or anything, but I don't sell it because I don't believe that it's something that can be sold.
No.
But it is what is sold to everybody, like, join our brotherhood. Like, oh, you get to pay money and then be someone's brother? Is that how that works? And the same thing is like, or if you take an oath to be somebody's brother, does that really make them your brother? I'm a little cynical about that process.
I agree.
From having some bad experiences with it myself as well. I think that brotherhood is something that happens organically, like actual, like, oh, we are really good friends. Like we are really good friends. We really care about each other. We really respect each other. We would do pretty much anything for each other, whatever. That's something that happens organically. You can, like a military has a great example, and a lot of guys get out of the military and then they want that and they'll go places looking for it. But you can't manufacture a state organization putting you into groups with people and then making you spend like all your time with them, because that fast tracks that whole process. In real life, you can't, well, not real life, that's real life, but in civilian life, people don't have that much time. And it takes a really long time to build that kind of relationship that you guys would have had in a much shorter period of time, because you've gone through struggles together and you've lived with each other, and it's like a whole fast track of the process. Like in the sense that I had that to a certain extent years ago when I was delivering exercise equipment. My best friend and I mean, he wasn't my best friend until we'd been driving around for a while, but like you're in a truck together for 9 hours a day and then doing things that are difficult together. You either become friends or enemies, really quickly. And so and so you need that time investment. And that's really the only thing that I believe really creates that kind of relationship is that time investment. And men take a long time to feel each other out, especially in the civilian world, I think, because they're not pushed together so fast. They want to see how, just see how it works out over time. They're not in a real hurry. In the terms of brotherhood, it's such a powerful word, and people, because men want that, and they want it for all the reasons that I wrote about in The Way of Men. It's part of their structure is to desire this thing, is to desire this esteem of a group of men and to have a place in it. And when they don't have it, they get very nervous and uncomfortable, and I've talked about that a bunch. But it's such an easy sale. It's like if you can sell brotherhood and camaraderie, dudes are like, they're the guys who, as we've talked about, the ones who want to be like too cool for school and they can't, I'll never be part of a group that would have me and all that kind of bullshit. But a lot of guys really want to have brotherhood and camaraderie, and they don't have it because they aren't in an institution like the military, and once they get out of school, they all go to different places. And they're very distinct. A lot of men just really don't have a lot of friends. And so you can sell them on brotherhood and camaraderie really quickly, but then it's very easy to manipulate them with that. And so it's very, because of whatever my own moral compass is, I feel uncomfortable doing that. So I will, but it's what works. So that's the
for a while. I mean, I don't know if I would argue it as working in the long term, But I might
Yeah,
be. I mean, I might, and I'm just saying, like, how are you measuring working? Because is this a case where you fake it until you make it? That we're all brothers and because we all paid for the same class, and then eventually we actually become real friends? I don't see that as being effective. All of my best friends, if I think about the people that I've known for a long time, or the people that I've considered the men that have been closest in my life, and this is just, again, it's anecdotal. Very long-term friends, very deliberate in becoming friends, or the circumstances upon us becoming friends were ideal in illustrating the character qualities between us that we admired in one another. So one of them is duration, all the times that we've both loved and hated one another. Another one was sort of these are just keynote examples. Deliberate of observation, assessment, consideration, pursuit, conclusion, or the circumstances that we found ourselves in at the same place at the same time were such that it illustrated a set of character traits and values that were shared between us that we both embraced at that time with one another. So there's some authenticity questions there. But those are friends. It's not the same thing as like a brotherhood. And I can see that you could sell brotherhood, but honestly, it's kind of like maybe I'm in the position where it comes across as you can tell when it's a marketing phrase and you can tell when it's used genuinely. And maybe one of those examples is, am I boasting about my brotherhood on a paid ad on Instagram or through X or through social media? Then I'm probably trying to get your attention, and maybe it works for some people.
Yeah.
And I don't have it.
And if you actually have a strong group and you use that, because it is, I mean, marketing words work for a reason. I mean,
Yes.
the way that the word alpha is retarded, but like everyone uses it.
Alpha is retarded. Cancel. Canceled.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I've said it, been saying that for years. It's just a dumb way to set up the hierarchy. But
it's people who think they're smart using words that they're not using them very well. It's like, oh well, yeah, I'm an alpha, he's a beta.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's retarded, but like but it is effective, and
Sure.
and it'll get people into like reading all the other material and bring them into the other things, and then they get whatever. So it's one of those trade-offs that people use. Like I know a guy, I know a bunch of guys who use that word, and they actually do have something to offer, but
Sure.
like they've just like said, hey, I'm going to use that. And the same thing with brotherhood. I mean, I know guys who use the brotherhood thing, and that's what gets you in, but they are trying to provide value. They're not just trying to make a quick buck, because there's a lot of that too.
There's a lot of that, and at risk of becoming jaded and saying everyone who uses the word brotherhood is just a marketing asshole trying to steal my money. I don't want to go down that road, because I think that level of like nihilistic cynicism is the destruction of all hope and value. So
Sure.
in this one, I remember as a younger man reading quite often about the rite of passage, and then in our modern world we complain about not having a rite of passage,
Right.
and so. There was this time in both writing or listening, reading, and writing about the subject, hearing this constant reference to a need for a rite of passage. And I think in many of my generation, me being a little younger than you, oftentimes did see the military as that opportunity for a rite of passage. And and in my own experience, I approached it that way, and it was not a good idea. It was bad. It had some negative consequences. And in such, how then how do you speak about a community, a brotherhood, a group of people that you consider, and I'm putting all these words together at the same time, that has some sort of exclusivity? Is there a rite of passage or a rite of entry that is official or unofficial? Because you said earlier, if I don't think someone will fit in the group, I'm not going to invite them. That's an unofficial rite of passage. Getting the approval of Meemaw can be a rite of passage. How have you approached that?
Well, I make people apply, and I have a handful of questions that are going to be like that's going to give me what I need to know in the baseline. Doesn't mean they always work out, and sometimes the ones that you're like, I don't know about this guy, ends up being like the best guy. But if there's a baseline, like we definitely can't have this, and then that'll your answers to that will give me enough to like be like, okay, we'll give you a shot.
Sure.
I can't be like super exclusive because I would like to have more than 5 people in the group, but that's a good starting point. And as far as the group, I think our guys would actually love to have some kind of, especially guys who've been in for a long time, love to have some kind of initiation rite or something like that. But because I think about concepts. I have to feel like there's a reason for it.
Okay,
Like
so you have
I mean, we have like in all groups you join a group, and well, not in all groups, but a lot of groups these joins you have like a starting challenge or something like that. We have something like that, and we do have everybody read the same 3 books.
Okay.
Like in your first 3 months, there are 3 books I want you to read so we all have a common culture.
yes.
Like we all have this frame of reference. So
Yes.
you create something like that. So that's part of the things that I've done to build that. But as far as putting someone through some kind of trial, in many cases you see these groups that do that online that are very, okay, put them through some trial. But into what? Like what are they being welcomed into? Like what are they preparing them to go to? And that's the question. Like what are we, like when people say, and this really comes from the 90s, like, mythopoetic men's movement, this idea that we needed to have initiation rituals and so forth. If you look at, they tried to create those, but like, well, what are you being created? What are you being initiated into?
Yes.
Like, and in a tribal society, which is what they're always talking about, the tribal society has like very defined expectations about what a role of a man is.
Okay.
And so in modern society, like what are you initiating a man into? Because you have a society that's very conflicted about what the role of a man is. So it's a little bit trickier to do. And so it has to be more on a personal level, like not personal, but more niche, I would say. It's like in the sense of like you could initiate someone into like say a Christian manhood group, right? Because okay, here's our expectations about what a man in our group does, and so that's more where you'd have to be. Whereas rather than just being a man in society, I think that's too broad in American culture right now as it stands to initiate people into. So I think for initiations, I think there has to be a clear why, and also like, it's different when you have a paid group, and it's different when you have a voluntary group. Like
Yeah.
military can do things to you that you can't say no to. I have to remind people this because a lot of guys, they want to set things up like that.
Yeah.
And you can't, in a modern civilian group, it's always voluntary.
It has to be. Yeah.
And so it has to be. So you can't make the same demands of people that you would make in a military group because, like, no one can court-martial you.
Yes.
And so like there's a different level. Like if you don't like it anymore, you can just leave. And so like you have to it's not the same. You can't act as much. You can't wield as much authority in the same way.
This is
A
true.
little bit nicer. Yeah.
Yeah. So the true initiation of being in that the military does is when they give you the booster of shots all into your right ass cheek and you have a cramp for 2 days. That's the real initiation. Now you're a man. Try to walk it off. Just like, oh, it's not your first time jumping out of a plane, or we gave you smallpox. Now you're a man. Like, I mean, I guess that was what happened right before our first deployment, but whatever. I can definitely I can see where the problem arises with authorities. Now, caveat, there is a phrase that's used within the military, and that is are you a first, second, third, or fourth time volunteer? And so like a first time volunteer, there's another way of phrasing it, and I can't remember what it is, but like a first time volunteer is a person who joins the military. A second one is someone who joins the military and then also volunteers for airborne school. So that'd be like a double volunteer. A triple volunteer is Army Airborne School, Special Operations, Ranger Battalion, Navy SEALs, Green Berets. And then a fourth, a quadruple volunteer would be someone who joins the military, goes to airborne school, goes to Ranger Battalion, and then eventually goes into Delta Force or CAG. So there is still this kind of voluntarism. The higher you go, the more voluntary participation is necessary. No one's going to force you to go to selection. You have to choose. That means you have to choose to get ready for it. That means you have to choose to be worthy of it. That means you have to pursue it. And so while there is an involuntary aspect to it, I don't get to choose. Oh, okay, today we're doing a 12-mile ruck march. All right, today we're doing a 12-mile ruck march. I don't get to choose all of that. I do get to have some sections. There are noteworthy pointed elements of voluntarism. So, like I was bringing up earlier, there's this first, second, third, fourth, or whatever, and they're still very distinct. Like you don't get to be a triple volunteer for being a medic. You have to have these things, these criteria to be met. And given the reputation of it is a very small world. I met my squad leader, and my private's private in basically a 30-day span. After like 10 years after leaving the military. So it's kind of a funny small world.
Yeah. One of the things that I'm learning, because I'm just learning this as I go along. How do you run a group? How does this work? Right. There's no exact guide for what exactly I'm trying to do. And so one of the things that I'm learning is how to facilitate that kind of voluntarism.
Sure.
In terms of, and realizing that people will do it. Like realizing that guys want to do it. And that we're getting at the point now where guys, have not only volunteered for leadership roles in things and volunteered to take on responsibilities that I don't want. In terms of, I have two guys who are act as coordinators for new members, so that they can have someone to reach out to and keep track of all their stuff. Because I shouldn't be doing that. I can't keep track of what everybody's personal goals are and all this stuff. I'm not a life coach. There's, so I have guys taking those kinds of responsibilities and volunteering for projects because they get invested enough in the thing that they want to make it better. And that they want it to have more guys in it, and they want the guys to be better and more invested, and so they're taking it upon themselves to do that work and to volunteer for it, and so facilitating their ability to do that, I think, is something that I'm learning how to do myself, and and have done it more like this is a dumb example maybe, but recently, one of the things there were things that weren't working in terms of our communications, in terms of inspiring communications, like if you're a figure like me or whatever, you get to a point where like you feel like you have to monkey dance, like if they won't talk unless I do something, unless I prompt them or whatever, they won't interact in the right way, and I got tired of it, and I was like, well, we're gonna do a thing. Well, we'll start. We have a Telegram group, and that's where we have all our everyday conversations. And Telegram has folders. And I'm like, I will start a folder for any topic, but you're going to be responsible for keeping it going. I don't want a dead folder. Like so whoever wants to start a topic, you're in charge of that topic. And I don't, it has a refresh rate to a certain amount of days where it deletes. And I'm like, I don't want to see a dead topic, or I'll just delete it. Like it's gone. So like they have an investment in keeping that discussion going and keeping like that. And that's actually worked out really well. So it's just interesting, like all the psychology behind leadership and running these things and how men want to interact in the world right now. It's been it's a learning process.
It seems like from where I stand, it's a subject that has plenty of pitfalls from, as you were bringing up earlier, the kind of cheap marketing of brotherhood in order to make a quick buck to, an elevation of the tribe to the level of an idol, where it actually starts. It intend in some sense and manner is attempting to replace a moral system itself. Whatever's good for the tribe is good is good. It seems like there are plenty of pitfalls, but it's not something to be ignored or left alone. Like we in a sense, as men, we need it. We need to have our own participation, tacitly or
Absolutely.
otherwise.
And I've been in some tribes that didn't work out for me, and I actually had a guy who would not work out for any of things that I'm in now, but he was like, oh, like so if your girlfriend breaks up with you, you're not gonna date anymore, And I was like, oh, that was actually kind of a good example. Like okay, you didn't find the right tribe. That doesn't mean that that's that you have to be black pilled on that idea of having that. And
Yeah,
so
well-
like, just keep, okay, well, what did I learn about myself and what kind of tribe I want to be part of and what I'm
Yeah.
willing to sacrifice and what I'm not,
I'm somewhat convinced that the black pill is just a new attempt at rebranding postmodernism into, and I believe I've distilled postmodernism into a single phrase. If I can't understand it, or if I don't understand it, it is non-comprehensible. If I don't understand it, it can't be understood. That's basically what postmodernism is to me. It's
Okay.
if it doesn't work for me, it's not real. And so that's why you get that sort of black pill cynicism of, I had a bad experience and it didn't work out for me. Therefore, whatever it is can't be real. I had a bad experience with religion. I read a book and it didn't turn out to be true. It's like, maybe you're just an idiot. Like maybe you're just an idiot, dude. Maybe you're like, hey, I hate to break it to you, but a lot of history is full of people falling off bridges. I remember hearing a story of a distant family member who went off to this is a distant family member who was living in Sweden, took their cart to a big city to go find a wife, didn't find a wife, and they took their cart back to their small town, and on the way it fell over and he died. Like, you're like, sometimes you're not the main character, man.
Life just wasn't for you.
Exactly. It's just like, well, I mean, I'm sure there's more to the story of that, and there is some tragedy there, but in its own element. Like, and when I'm saying distance, there's no way. And this guy was long gone before I was even alive, so we're not even worried about that. It's like 5 generations or 4 generations removed, and I thought that's a really odd thing to keep in the family history book. But so as we're gonna wrap up here, because we're kind of coming to the end of the time, we didn't get deep into art, and I wonder if I don't know if we have time, because if we're going to close up here in about 5 to 10 minutes, I'm interested in your take on art then, a particularly masculine art, and how, as you say, it's been dominated by the left, but what do you think an ideal change and shift in that might look like?
Well, art is always synthesizing things that came before and making them new by putting them in new combinations with other things. We make art a little bit more like AI than I wish that it was true, but it does it in a similar process in the same way of like, here are my 10 influences now mixed up and put it together. That's really what artists do. Like that's the way I would do it if I was going to approach a project. Like, okay, well, what am I going to look at? And so you're going to take obviously examples from masculine art in the past, of which there are many. Like masculine, as I always say, men made all the art like in the world before a certain date. For most of history, we made the majority of the art. Whether it was poetry or music or architecture or sculpture or painting, and made most of it. And so like it all has our imprint on it, which is one of the criticisms that the left makes of art, is that it's all the male gaze. it's all what men want, and it's all what men do. There's this famous book that I had to read in college, in art school, called The Ways of Seeing by John Berger, and it's all about like how men, how men painted a lot of nude ladies, basically. But it was like the things that men want are what gets painted. Their vision is what makes it onto the canvas. And that's true, and that's cool. And so we just have to do that again. What do men want, and what do they care about? And what, how do we re-express that? What kind of lines does that have? And like I said, the one artist that I like, Fendevier, he does stuff that I think captures a lot of that. But there's so much more, and there are a lot of people, men out there making art, a lot more than we tend to think of, because we tend to think of the worst art. There's a tendency in the non-left to think of the worst art as the example of art in society, where there are actually a lot of men making art in the world, a lot of men making music in the world that isn't bad. There's a lot out there, and we just think of the worst first. And if you think of a lot of the work that men did in the past, like in terms of, you brought up the Iliad. I mean, like, if you asked men if they liked poetry, if poetry was masculine, they would say, "Oh no!" Like a lot of men would be like, But men, dominated that form for a few thousand years.
And John Lovell recently published The Warrior Poet Way. I don't know. I like agree and disagree with you at the same time. I think the caricature of poetry being non-masculine was a very short-lived experiment.
Well, no, I mean, I think that is. I think that there's still plenty of that.
Sure.
There's still plenty of that. Yeah, I know. Obviously, I've met John, and he did that. That's his vibe. But there's still a lot of men who would be very turned off by that.
Fair.
And I'm glad that it's changing. I mean, that it should change. It was, as you said, it is a short-lived and poor experiment, but we still have a good bit of work to do. And like in my group, actually, like I generally, because it worked out the first time I did it, I was surprised by the turnout, and so I generally have a poetry contest running.
Nice.
So we have there's like a $100 prize, and everybody votes on it. What's one they like the best, and so guys are writing poetry. Every few months I do one. I give them a theme, and to kind of encourage that. And so I think that, but yeah, there are a lot of men who have no relationship to that at all left in the world. But there is, that's a form that men dominated. And well, if you want to think about the art of the future, well, what does it contain? Well, it contains things that are like that form, but made new. It made new. Chris actually said something on one of our podcasts one day that it was very challenging to me. But he was right in the sense of we have this idea that everything good has to come from the past, and that you can't find beauty in the modern world.
Okay.
And and he's like, the real challenge is to find the beauty in the modern world and make art about that. And it's not in my nature to do that. Like I'll tend to put things out of time and try to think mythically and beyond time. But I mean, you think about so much. I mean, the Hollywood movies and things like that that really impact people. I mean, some of them are based on ancient ideas or period pieces or whatever, but so many of them are like, what's the story? Can you find the story about a man who does, the right thing or is in an interesting situation or whatever in the context of our world? And then that's really what contemporary art is. I mean, if you had someone in ancient Greece, they're writing about ancient Greece. While they're writing about their contemporaries.
Yes.
And a lot of times they're writing about something that happened 300 years ago too. There's a lot of that. But, a lot of the great art from the past is people writing about things that happened in their time. That things that are imagined in their world. So I mean, I think it was an interesting challenge, and that to make something new without trying to scrub all of modernity out of it, because I think there's a lot of us, including me, have a tendency to try to do that.
I will admit that I have a hard time looking out into the contemporary world and saying, "Oh, this is beautiful." I do. I struggle, and maybe there's a moral compulsion or a moral component to rejecting that sort of fatalistic nihilism, or that fatalistic, everything before was good and everything after might be good, but whatever is now is terrible. That's
Yeah. Well, it's like the guy I lived with yesterday actually said it, and then it turned out to be a mistake. He was like, I'm going to watch the opening ceremony of the Olympics because he's like, I don't want to hate everything in the world.
Oops. Whoa. Oops. Yeah. That was a mistake. Yeah.
Because I walked in the room like, why are you watching that? You know it's going to be garbage. And he's like, well, I don't want to hate everything in the world. And I'm like, ooh, probably not the right choice.
Oh,
but,
no.
But the same...
That's like, no. There's some dark poetry in that, because you're like, you know what? I want to watch something that is modern, that's going to make me happy and feel good about where we're, trying to see some good. Oh, gosh. No. Like,
yeah.
It's like, oh, that's kind of like, oh, I'm gonna go help the old lady cross the road, and then she turns out to be like a serial rapist, and you're like, oh no, she's trafficking kids. What did I do? Like,
yeah, there is a little bit of that. I mean, you do have to let go of stuff a little bit and be able to enjoy a little bit of contemporary culture without just hating everything, because that's not a way to live.
No.
But you can't like. I'll watch some shows with dragons all day long, like the House of Dragons. Yes, there's an agenda in the background, blah, 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 blah. I don't care. I just want to see dragons.
I just want to see dragons.
I want to see dragons and knights fighting and stuff like that. I'll sit through the other stuff. I just want to see that. I'll just put it aside. But yeah, I mean, I think that you can look at, there are stories in the world. Now, they're not going to be, they're not knights fighting dragons, right? But there are stories out there. I mean, there's compelling stuff. I mean, you just had a president get shot on TV.
We did.
Yeah. I mean, there's things that are happening in the world. That's what's been really interesting. Chris and I have talked about that. Everything is like a joke on Fukuyama at this point. Like the end of history did not happen. There's still, things are still moving. Things are still happening. So, there are a lot of, you can find that in the world. You just have to look for it. And there's a lot of purity and decency. I mean, that's still out there. I mean, I see it all the time. I mean, I live in a very privileged and sheltered area.
Fair.
In the sense that, and I mean, I've been out in the real world. So I've been the rest of it. I moved here for a reason. But, I live in a community surrounded by, with a golf course in the center, in an area that's probably heavily Mormon, and is very family oriented. I can't throw a rock without hitting a school or a church. And there's a lot of just decent people just trying to do their best in life. And so, that's out there too. And so I think it's important to remember that.
Well, good. Well, in closing then, considering that you made a distinction between being a good man and being good at being a man, when it comes back to the capacity for violence and use of force, that would fall mostly, and we've talked about a number of topics, whether it's strength and mostly strength and honor, and I think courage would be the third part in that for sure. Well, I mean, when it comes to the use of force, you're going to have all four: strength, courage, mastery, and honor. Right. Can you use your tools? Are you going to be a coward? Are you willing to pursue and appeal to the desires of your comrades? And then are you able to do the job or complete the task? Consistently, I've found that people who are lacking in any one or all four of those traits are also the most likely to be making threats. Oftentimes it's just simply dishonorable, or they're cowardly because there's never a consequence for it. Right. I think that day is coming, I think that time is actually starting to sunset. As I mean, we look at the one that happened with Donald Trump. Someone tries to shoot him. people get on the internet, they go, oh man, shouldn't have missed. People find them, people fire them. It's like it's there are now there are consequences, and sure, people will complain about freedom of speech all day long. It's like, okay, maybe we shouldn't throw them in prison, but I wouldn't want to employ somebody who is cheering on the assassination of the president.
Right.
But that being the case, this conversation has gone only partially in a direction that I expected it to, and I'm thankful for that. So if we're going to close it out on, we've talked about brotherhood, we've talked about violence and use of force, we've talked about kind of antisocial, or not necessarily antisocial, but artificial attempts at manipulating these kind of arenas. When it comes to the use of force, what is a piece of advice that you would give, especially whether it's in training or community building?
When it comes to the use of force.
Yeah, so like jujitsu, we're going to train to go fight jujitsu. That helps build camaraderie because you have to struggle with it. But that doesn't guarantee that it's going to stick. What have you seen about in your writing, particularly about the masculine virtues, that has to do with the capacity and any moral compulsion around it? It's a hard question.
I'm not sure. I'm not finding really where in there.
Maybe then I'll have to phrase it another way, because this is like Nathan Spearing says, it's building a plane mid-flight. It's when you found men to be honorable, what other traits have you oftentimes found in them?
Well, honorability and loyalty, I think, are the same thing almost.
Okay.
So that's I would say loyalty, but then, like I say, they are almost the same concept. But I mean, that's the guys I've tried to associate. I mean, earlier you mentioned being a good man and being good at being a man, and people often, and I know you don't, but people mistake try to frame it as though I'm saying that they're mutually exclusive, and that they're definitely not. But you just have to separate the concepts in order to understand really what masculinity is at its core, because it's not always moral as you would like it to be. Okay. So that's the important part. But the men who I surround myself with, or whatever, I mean, it's a wide berth, really. Like you have men of all different skills. I always say, like, if you have a good group, there is a little bit of a superhero team aspect to like everybody has different powers, and they bring something different to the table. I mean, I have a guy whose main things he brings to the table are like cooking, and he speaks and reads Sanskrit, and brings all this knowledge about this thing that almost nobody knows about too, but probably has no real experience with violence or anything like that. And then I also have a former Marine Raider, who has a total, like, the entire other end of the spectrum. And what is really appreciated, and I think this is true with any group of men, is that you really appreciate when something's out of somebody's wheelhouse, that they'll at least try it.
Okay.
That they'll at least give it a shot. I think that that's the important thing, that men respect in each other. It's like, hey, this isn't going to be your thing. You're not going to be the best at this because you're really good at this other thing. But it's important that you demonstrate that you're not above it, and that you'll give it a shot, and that you'll maybe even be the one who looks bad. Like, it looks the worst of the group at a thing, but you'll participate in it. And I think that builds a lot of trust and loyalty in groups, just because, like, okay, he's one of the team, he'll do the thing, even though that he's not, like, that's not his thing. I mean, like, I'm not a super gun guy. I understand the reasons for why we should have them and all the theoretical things behind them, but it's not my, like, primary field of interest. But I'll go out and shoot with the guys. you know, and I'll be like, hey, I'm a retard. Let me show, like, like, okay, and do that. And so, in the same thing, like with any other members in a group, you need guys who will be like, hey, I'll participate in the thing. This isn't my thing. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm a retard, but like, you know, show me what to do. And, you know, guys who are, I guess, humble enough to do that.
Wonderful. I think that's I find that very useful. It's just some that people who are unwilling to try something that might even be trivial, but they'll be uncomfortable at it because they'll be the new guy.
Right.
People who are willing to make those attempts very oftentimes are considered honorable. I appreciate that. It might be a rule by definition, but we'll work it out.
Yeah.
Well, Jack,
I mean, if you think about it, it is a thing that almost every man respects that. Like,
yes.
You don't have to be the best one, but if you see that a guy is trying, okay, he's trying.
Okay.
He's literally trying his best. You know,
Yeah.
it's a men respect that. I think almost universally.
I think there might be certain men who don't, but I would usually describe them with negative words.
Right.
That are but that's beyond today's conversation. But all right, Jack, well, thank you for coming on the show. Thank you for having this long conversation about this inverse relationship between capacity for violence and likelihood to participate in it, the kind of threats. We went through culture and boasting, and then we talked about things like brotherhood and community and finding honor in other men. So I really do appreciate it. I know some of the people who listen to the show will be familiar with your work, but for your ongoing writing and shows that you're putting on, where do people find you?
I'm on Instagram at Start the World. I'm on X at it's Mr. Jack Donovan, like Mr. Jack Donovan, and my website is jack-donovan.com. All my books you can get on Amazon. That's the best place to get them. People always ask. And then I have signed copies and merch in my stores. There's a store at starttheworld.com, and then the Order of Fire has its own website, theorderoffire.com, or just orderoffire.com. Sorry. And there's a store there as well, and that's where you can find more about the Order of Fire. And then the rest of my work you can find at jackdonovan.com. Jack-Donovan.com. Unfortunately, I didn't get jackdonovan.com. Even 12 years ago, I was not able to get that. But you know, that's where you can find all my stuff. So.
Alrighty. Well, I look forward to seeing some of your work, and maybe one of these days we'll actually have a good conversation. You can throw me around on the mat and teach me how to do some things on jiu-jitsu, and then I'll be the gun guy for once.
Cool. Sounds good.
Mm-hmm. Alrighty. So with that, we're going to close. Thank you for listening. This has been the Redacted Culture Cast. If you want to keep us up and running, you can find us over at redactedllc.com. But this has been a conversation with Jack Donovan on masculinity, violence, and brotherhood. Thank you very much for paying attention. We'll catch you soon. Now go forth and conquer.